Chapter 7: The Field of Battle. The morning mist had settled low over the green grassy fields and intertwined with the scattered oak and maple trees, casting an aura of foreboding within the silence of the countryside beyond. Caleb looked quickly around and found himself standing all alone, knee-deep in the bluish-green waters of a small pond. Looking up towards the ridge, Caleb strained his eyes to see what lay in the distance. It was hard to perceive the nature of the shapes and figures hidden by the mist, as being anything that was man or beast from the distance and thickness of the fog. Moving slowly out of the water, Caleb was careful not to make any noise that might betray his position to any predators possibly lurking beyond. The silence was deafening. All Caleb could hear was the thrush of his heart beating inside his head and the soft sounds of his deep labored breathing. Strange, he thought, no bird calls, nor morning larks, not even the normal sounds within the stillness of the air, which Caleb often observed has its own uniqueness to it, only the sound of, he paused in his thoughts, death. At this point, fear would normally have taken over for Caleb. However, for the very first time in his life, Caleb came to the realization that this was all part of one of his prophetic dreams. At the very second he realized this, he found that he had the urge to wake himself up, but rather do that, he forced himself continue the dream unabated. He wanted, desired earnestly, to glean as much information as he could from it, unlike the other dreams of the past. In those, he would always wake up unsure of its meaning, and with more questions than he had answers. "Hello," he called out in a soft voice. No response was given. Caleb began walking gingerly up the gently sloping hill towards one of the shapes and figures that he had seen earlier, which had been obscured by the morning mist. Pausing as he neared the top of the hill, he called out again. "Anyone out there?" he asked again. Again, no response was given. Earlier, Caleb had not wanted a response, but now he was looking forward to, eager for one. Caleb reached the efforts of his walk up the hill, one of the shadowy shapes in the mist which stood at the crest. It was a long dead tree stump with short, stubbly branches going out in all directions. It was as black as coal and had a slight oily sheen to it, reflecting the gray misty light. At one time it must have been an incredible sight, perhaps the tallest tree for miles around. Now it stood like a sentinel, awaiting some ghostly army's return. Caleb had been so enthralled at the sight of the tree and its subsequent examination that he hadn't taken time to notice what lay beyond the tree in the field on the other side of the hill. Caleb froze. Motionless bodies lay strewn in the grass in all directions. In the distance, next to several of the bodies, he saw several horses. Some were still standing next to the bodies, grazing on the grass with their tails sweeping slowly side to side, seemingly unconcerned about what had taken place, while others lay motionless themselves on the ground with their deceased riders still mounted on their saddle. He wanted to wake up again, but forced the dream to play out. Cautiously, Caleb walked over to where the closest body lay in the grass, to examine it better up close. As Caleb approached, he took note of their appearances. Some had been shot with arrows, several arrows in fact, and so had many of the horses. While some were killed with arrows, others appeared to have been killed in hand-to-hand combat, with knives and swords still gripped tightly in their grasp. Young men all, it seemed, about the same age as his brother, while a few could have been nearly Caleb's age. This one had his face, chest, and arms painted up in strange colors, green, black, yellow, and brown patterns. What would they do that for? He wondered. Caleb continued to slowly examine each one. It almost reminded him of a story about the ancient American Indians his mother read to him years ago. What was it called? He couldn't remember. That's right, it was called war paint. It had to be, but for what reason? What war? He looked around for something familiar that he might recognize that would tell him what this place was, a signpost or some familiar landmark, anything. Although the land looked familiar, this was a place that he had never been to before. It wasn't until he came to the two young men who had been fighting each other hand to hand that Caleb began to feel anxiety setting in. One of them looked familiar to him. As he approached closer, he recognized the blonde hair and the brown leather hat. "Mark, are you okay? Tell me, what happened here?" he shouted, quickly kneeling to shake him, hoping he would be alive, but it was of no use. Caleb closed his eyes tightly, hoping to end the dream at this point, but as he slowly opened his eyes again and stood up, he noticed several bodies in the distance that began to look familiar as well. Suddenly he glanced off to one side and noticed a large stone marker in the distance that had some writing etched into it. At last, he thought, I must see this. Caleb walked quickly over to the large stone that was lying on its side in the field and looked down at it to get a closer look at the large writing etched onto the stone and began to read the letters, MANASSAS. What are you feeling, Caleb? Asked the voice coming from behind him. Caleb spun around quickly to see who it was. It was a shadowy figure. He couldn't tell if it was male or female. Caleb wondered if it was that same girl again from one of his earlier dreams. Is all this something that will happen because of me? He asked. These are visions of things that may happen, the voice explained. You must prepare yourself. Caleb looked over to where Mark Redding was lying dead in the grass. What do you mean, prepare? He asked. How can something that I do lead to all this? Asked Caleb, pointing to the spot in the grass where Mark and the other boy were lying, afraid to look any farther out, lest he find more familiar faces. The shadow figure began to walk slowly around the bodies lying in the grass, motioning to each of the dead bodies as it continued, You will have to make the decision, Caleb, whether or not you are going to give the others what they want. The voice paused and turned away from him as if in deep thought, before facing Caleb once again. You will soon discover what it is they seek, the voice continued, but know this, once you head down that path, this vision will change, but you must be prepared to suffer some. Who are you? Asked Caleb, growing frustrated. You know me well, the voice replied. But I don't know you. Who are you and who are the others? Demanded Caleb. The voice and vision began to slowly fade. Soon you will, Caleb, soon you will, the voice continued as it slowly faded away. Who are you? Caleb cried out, shaking himself from head to toe. Then he awoke. Caleb opened his eyes slowly to look around. He was quite relieved to discover that he was safe in his bedroom. It was early morning, as Caleb noticed the light from outside barely trickling through the flap of his tent. No one was awake yet, except perhaps his mother, who was usually up early tending to her morning chores. He strained his ears to hear. Yes, she's awake, he thought. I can hear her outside. Caleb jumped up out of his cot, quickly grabbing one of his robes and throwing it around him for warmth as the morning chill made him start to shiver. As Caleb stepped out of his room, he noticed his mother Sarah holding tightly onto young Jessica, whom was propped up on the edge of one of the long tables outside, with one hand while wringing out a small soapy towel with the other. She was just about to wipe Jessica off with the soapy towel as she noticed Caleb standing next to her. Caleb, you startled me, gasped Sarah, jumping slightly. What are you doing up so early? She asked. I had another one of those weird dreams, whispered Caleb. Sarah paused immediately in mid-stroke of cleaning up Jessica's face with the soapy towel. You did? Yes, Caleb suddenly noticed his sister Jessica's messy pajamas. Is Jessica okay? Your sister will be fine. Her stomach is a little upset. I think she had a bit too much ice cream and cake last night at the Daniels barbecue. Anyway, tell me about your dream, Sarah asked, continuing her cleaning up of Jessica as she intently listened. Caleb reiterated as many details of the dream as he could remember to his mother Sarah, stopping at the point in his dream where the mysterious figure appeared. And it was blaming me for whatever it was that had happened, protested Caleb. Sarah listened carefully to Caleb, finishing up Jessica, then setting her on the ground and shooing her back towards her room. And be careful that you don't wake up your sister. Yes, Mommy. Hi, Caleb, squeaked Jessica, turning around and walking quickly but quietly back to her tent as she went inside. Caleb and Sarah waited until Jessica had returned to her tent to continue further with the conversation. So, did you recognize anyone else in your dream other than Mark Redding? Asked Sarah. No. He paused. I was afraid to look around anymore, uttered Caleb. Sarah motioned for Caleb to follow her as she walked over to the long serving table that had been set up near the main tent, as she rinsed and cleaned up the towels in the large bowls that had been filled earlier with hot water. That voice kept telling me to be prepared for something, Caleb recalled, and that the things I saw were only things that may happen, not will happen. You know something, Caleb, I think it's remarkable that you were able to let your dream continue this time without waking up and stopping it, continued Sarah, as she thought carefully. It shows that you're growing up, Caleb. Caleb must have given his mother a look of disbelief, because she stepped backwards and looked him up and down as a serious expression came over her. You have been having dreams like this since you were a little boy, Caleb. Some of those have been just normal dreams that we all have occasionally, but now lately, as you've gotten older, your dreams have become more, she thought carefully, vivid and prophetic. Prophetic? Caleb rubbed the back of his neck. Like the vision you had about the sinkhole years ago, when you were a little boy, Sarah reminded him. You have a gift, Caleb. Learn how to use your gift to help you make the decisions you will need to make in the future. Caleb thought about seeing Mark Redding dead on the field, and then all the others who were scattered around that he had been unable to recognize, and then there was that stone in the field with the writing on it. Sarah folded the towels that she had been cleaning and placed them neatly on the table to dry, then reached around Caleb's shoulders and kissed him gently on the cheek. I'm glad you came and told me about this. It's going to be okay, she paused, and then added. I love you, Caleb. I love you too, Mom, echoed Caleb, who stood quietly as he watched his mother continue cleaning off the table and getting ready to fix a morning meal. You better clean up and get changed. I think your father has plans for you and your brother this morning. Sarah smiled at Caleb. He told me he wanted to start building our own house to live in. Imagine that, having our own house to live in, she continued, her thoughts drifting off as she began to think out loud to herself, rather than Caleb. Maybe we could even have a bathroom inside the house. Caleb grinned when he heard his mother continue. He was also excited when Elder Zachariah told the clan the news that they would be settling down permanently here, but getting out of these tents and wagons was something he knew everyone in the clan was looking forward to. Caleb had been too young to remember what it was like to live in a real house. Most of his life was spent living out of wagons and tents. He could only listen to all the stories that his mother and father shared about the years before the migration, when they used to live in homes in the old settlements far south of here. Caleb started to head back to his tent to get clean and change, when he stopped and turned back to his mother Sarah, who was beginning the morning meal. Mother, asked Caleb, what can you tell me about a place called Manassas?
You have been listening to Caleb Elgin, The Rise of the Clans, by David E. Farmer. Also available on Amazon Kindle. More chapters coming soon. Thank you for listening. Have a great day. Bye-bye.